As the Troubles entered their third decade, Northern Ireland seemed to be embroiled in a conflict without end. As the 1980s turned into the 90s, the paramilitary's list of targets appeared to be growing. Families attending a Remembrance Day service. Mourners burying their dead. Teenage girls working the night shift at a mobile shop. Everybody was a target.
We live in fear every day. Something happens that somebody's going to be singled out.
Armed with submachine guns and rocket launchers smuggled in via South Africa, Loyalists have become Northern Ireland's biggest killers.
These loyalist paramilitaries have become far more active in the last 3 years. So much so, they've now overtaken the IRA when it comes to the gruesome tally of death.
Not that the IRA had stopped killing. Blowing up 8 Protestant construction workers at Tuban on their way home from a job on an army base. 3 weeks later, Loyalists killed 5 Catholics in a betting shop in South Belfast. The early 90s seemed like the darkest of days. However, unknown to the vast majority of people, the Republican leadership, with the help of moderate nationalist leader John Hume, was in secret contact with the British government and edging towards a ceasefire. But the IRA couldn't be seen to be negotiating from a position of weakness. The increase in loyalist attacks challenged their claim to be defenders of the Catholic community. They had to be seen to be fighting back. High on their target list was Johnny Adair, a senior member of the Ulster Defence Association, the largest loyalist paramilitary group. He led a deadly gang in West Belfast, linked to dozens of attacks on Catholics.
Different leaders produce different results. If your leader says, right, let's get after the enemy, you'll get after them. If he says sit there tight, you sit tight. But the difference was me, I was saying, right, let's get the enemy.
In October 1993, the IRA tried to kill Adair with a bomb placed in the shop below the UDA's headquarters.
The Shankill Road was busy with lunchtime shoppers when the attack happened. 2 men dressed in white coats walked into Frizzell's fish shop at 1:15 and placed the bomb on the floor.
The bang went off and everybody ran and the thing came down round them. The people are all, I'm sure they're all killed that was in it.
But when the bomb went off, Johnny Adair wasn't in the building. 9 Protestant shoppers were killed, 2 of them children. Everyone knew what was coming next.
I think definitely something will happen. There'll be a reprisal somewhere along the line. Somebody will get it.
Panic and bloodshed in Belfast this afternoon.
The dead, the dying, the injured in the Rising Sun pub were all victims of loyalist gunmen. Indiscriminate carnage in revenge for the IRA bombing of the Shankill Road.
The fear here at the moment is quite tangible. I mean, you can nearly reach out and touch it.
Attacks happened on the street, in homes, and in places of work.
They fired between 40 and 60 shots. One of the dead men was killed in the first burst of gunfire.
Everybody's locking their doors, scared to answer them at night. I've been scared to answer my door for a couple of weeks now, to be quite honest with you.
It was the bloodiest month since the 70s. 24 people died in 1 week alone. It was the week of Roisin Kearns' 11th birthday.
I can remember it quite well, actually. In our household, and I'm sure most households, birthdays were always a big thing for mummy.
It was a happy wee bit of occasion because Roisin was in her element. She was getting plenty of presents.
At 7:30 that night, the Catholic family finished the party with a photo.
We finally got them round the table for this wee party, and you know, they were fed up with me and the camera. I was constantly taking photos.
10 minutes after Sheila Kearns took this photograph, she, her husband Eamon and youngest son Liam left the house. Roisin stayed behind with her elder brothers, 22-year-old Gerard and 18-year-old Rory.
Gerard and Rory were sitting in this room, and Rory was sitting exactly here because the TV would have been there, so Rory would have been here facing that way, and Gerard was just behind us here facing into that corner. I was in the kitchen, so I had a little TV to myself. Out of the corner of my eye, you could see the back door, and I seen some shadows. I must have felt something kind of ominous because I shouted up to Gerard and Rory, "There's somebody at the back door." And just as I was moving down here, that's when the gunmen burst in. I just froze at the table. So you've got two men in navy blue boiler suits and black balaclavas and huge guns. And one of them rushes into the living room, and another one puts his finger up to his mouth and looks at me. And he stands and watches me, and I'm frozen. And I could hear kind of smashing and glass.
7 bullets were fired. The brothers died instantly.
I don't know if this is minutes or seconds. And then they both run out past me through the back door.
We come down the road there, I could see the white tape fluttering in the wind up the road here. And I knew there was something desperately wrong.
The family home was now a major crime scene. It would be hours before Sheila and Eamon were allowed to see their sons.
It was just terrible. Looking at Gerard lad straight out. They were just beginning to start to get cold, not stone cold, but they were cold. Mm-hmm. I couldn't describe when they don't move. There's no movement. It mystifies you because they were so strong and full of life. On this deafening silence now in their children.
When Jared and Rory were buried, I wanted my birthday cake to go in with their coffins. I remember placing it in to their coffins. Just the childlike mind, doesn't it? And I have Jared's birthday card, and there's a bullet hole in it, and a few specks of blood, and I still have that card. There's no words for the pain and how harrowing that felt.
I always wanted to know why they were picked, why they were took out, why they could find this house, why they come into this house.
At the time, the murders were reported as a straightforward sectarian reaction to the Shankill bomb, a random attack on a random Catholic family. But we have found evidence that by this stage in the conflict, Loyalist violence was becoming less random and increasingly targeted.
Where are we? Where are we now with the maps?
Okay, so what we've got here is a list of Catholics who have died at the hands of Loyalists.
For over a year, we have been examining hundreds of murders attributed to Loyalists. Although they claimed to be fighting the IRA, few of their victims in the 1970s had any known Republican connection. Those that did are shown in green. Most Loyalists were simply targeting anyone perceived to be Catholic, and by doing so, terrorising a whole community. Among the most notorious, a murder gang who became known as the Shankill Butchers.
This killing is the last in a series of attacks on Catholic workers.
As he was lying on the ground, the gunman stepped up to him and fired one more shot into his head before making his escape.
2 out of the 3 injured were Roman Catholics.
They stalked traditionally Catholic areas, snatching victims off the streets, mostly at night, before torturing and killing them.
Another has got wounds in his right arm and both legs.
Loyalist murders dropped off in the early 80s, but from 1987 they rose again, and we've uncovered a significant change in the pattern of killings. By the middle of the 90s, nearly 1 in 5 of the victims of Loyalists had some connection to Republicanism. Of the Catholics killed by Loyalists between 1987 and 1994, 11 appear to have been active members of the IRA or other Republican paramilitaries. 10 were former Republican prisoners. 8 worked for or were members of Sinn Féin. And there was another category, their families. 15 people murdered, apparently, because they were related to Republicans. The cairns appear to fit this pattern.
The perception in the community, especially my Protestant community, I honestly believe to this day, they definitely believe that Jared and Rory was involved. With all that, all our lives was directed 24/7 into keeping our children out of all organisations.
Police said the boys were not members of any Republican group.
I felt devastated that 2 young men not involved in any organisation, that they should be shot down and taken, life should be taken from them in this way.
But their cousin, Sheena Campbell, had been a leading light in Sinn Féin. She was a law student, credited with helping devise the party's electoral strategy. Sheena Campbell had been murdered almost exactly a year before her cousins. Both sets of murders were claimed by the same organisation, the Ulster Volunteer Force. They were among 40 murders attributed to the Mid-Ulster UVF within a 6-year period, many of which were reported at the time as sectarian attacks on random Catholics. But almost half the victims had some connection to the Republican movement.
It takes time to realise or to understand. Perhaps now 20 or 25 years later, people are starting now to analyse and say and estimate what was happening then.
Tommy McKerney was a leading member of the IRA during the 80s. He was convicted for the murder of a part-time soldier and was a hunger striker. His family had been prominent Republicans in County Tyrone for generations.
Undoubtedly, if you look at what was happening, there were either relatives or people connected to some extent with the Republican movement assassinated by loyalists. And I don't think that was accidental.
None of Wright's gang has ever spoken publicly about their activities. Until now.
I was prepared to kill from the start, so I was. Because I seen it was the only way forward.
In 1994, Lawrence Maguire became the first person in the United Kingdom to be convicted of directing terrorism. He admitted 41 offences, including 5 murders. His first victim was a 43-year-old Catholic father of 3.
Terry McConville was in bed when a masked gunman broke into his house and shot him. The UVF have claimed he was a member of the IRA, but this has been denied by his family and by the security forces.
Just broke into the guy's house, and I think I was in every bedroom before I seen him, the target. And that was the first one I ever done.
You killed a man?
Aye, shot him 3 times.
Do you regret that now?
Regret, it's a hard word to decipher, regret. You know, I thought at the time I was doing right. Whether I still think that's debatable.
Who provided that man, or who set that man up for you as a target?
Billy Wright.
Billy Wright, one of the most sinister figures to emerge from 30 years of violence.
Do you feel that you can't be killed?
Oh, everyone can be killed. Everyone.
He's seen standing here with one of his closest associates, UVF killer Mark Fulton. Known as King Rat, his presence spread fear throughout the region.
You'd have rumours King Rat was seen in the Moy, King Rat was seen in Armagh, King Rat was seen in Dungannon. I mean, it was a terrible fear descended on people when a rumour went round that King Rat had been seen in the district.
If you look at history, you'll see that the most 2 active loyalist units in the province at the time, one was West Belfast UFF and the other was Mid-Ulster UVF. So yes, the 2 units were absolutely the 2 most active units throughout the province and 2 most ruthless units.
Billy Wright's leadership of the Mid-Ulster UVF coincided with the upsurge in loyalist violence.
He could have talked you into doing anything. He had the patter. If you never planned to do stuff, he had the talk. He could have talked the talk.
And what was the talk that he talked to you?
Oh, it was always just about killing, you know.
In the early 1990s, Maguire and Wright travelled these roads together, scouting out potential victims. According to Lawrence Maguire, Billy Wright masterminded the murders that Maguire committed.
We mentioned various targets to him, and it was always, no, leave it, let me do the targeting.
Maguire's claim makes Wright central to the Loyalist murder campaign in mid-Ulster in the early 90s. It places him at the heart of increased attacks on Republicans and their family members. Families like Tommy McKerney's. The McKerneys were steeped in republicanism. Tommy and two of his brothers were IRA members. Scotland Yard claimed Sister Margaret was involved in IRA offences in Britain, something she denied. She was never charged with any offence. Kevin McKerney was the youngest son. Police and Republican sources say he was never involved.
He knew what his brothers were involved in. But I think it was just normality for Kevin, to go to visit the prisons to visit his brothers, or his brothers to be arrested and go to court and that. I think it was just the norm.
The McKerneys lived in a village called the Moy in County Tyrone, right in the heart of an area that became known as the Murder Triangle. A few days before Christmas in 1991, a young Protestant teenager was brutally murdered here by Republican paramilitaries.
Robin Farmer was a first-year commerce student in Edinburgh. He'd come home for Christmas and was helping out at his father's shop in the village of Moy when a gunman opened fire. The teenager was hit in the chest as he tried to shield his father, a former RUC reservist.
Within days, the McKerneys received a death threat against the family butcher shop where Kevin worked. It was located just a few hundred yards from where Robin Farmer was killed.
Granny and Gran come up that evening and just wanted us, said no, we could pack up and move to Monaghan. Son, please go, take your wife and children with you, because there will be retaliation and you know that the butcher shop is going to be the target. So, but no, Kevin was adamant that he was born and reared in the Moy. He had his 4 children and me at home and he was going to stay.
Despite the threat, the family opened their shop after the Christmas and New Year's holiday.
Kevin came in and he gave me a kiss. He says, I'll see you later. And that was unusual, because he had just said cheerio, waved at you, but he just came in and gave me a kiss and said, I'll see you later.
Kevin McKerney and his uncle Jack were shot by the UVF late that afternoon.
Leading the mourners were Mr. McKerney's widow Bernadette, their 4 children, and his brother Thomas, who'd been freed from jail on parole to attend the funeral.
No one has ever been charged with their murders. If Bernadette thought the worst of her troubles were over, she was wrong. Her own family, the Foxes, were also prominent Republicans. 8 months after Kevin's murder, her brother Paddy Fox was convicted of possession of a huge IRA bomb weighing 1,000 pounds. A week later, Bernadette and her sister Teresa called at their parents' house.
I had come driving down this road and I would have parked in there in the street at the time.
The original Fox home has been replaced.
All I could hear was my RT's, squealing in the back. I could hear nothing, just horse squealing.
Less than a year after her husband's murder, Bernadette McKerney discovered the bodies of her parents.
We had a range in the kitchen and Daddy, he was lying beside it. And then I realised that they had been shot because I seen all the blood. Mummy had been lying and I seen bullet cases and that. Mummy was lying in the scullery and she had a sweeping brush beside her. Mummy would have probably took the sweeping brush to hit them a swipe. And we were told, when read in the inquest, our preliminary inquest thing was that she got her jaw broke where the gunman had hit her in the face with the butt of the gun.
Lawrence Maguire was involved in the plots to kill Bernadette's parents and her husband. But why were they targeted? Were they in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or was there a conscious plan to terrorise the Republican movement by targeting their families? Lawrence Maguire has agreed to show me where the UVF gang carried out their attacks.
We're coming up to the Fox's house now.
That's a good bit further back off the road.
Maguire says the parents were not the targets.
It wasn't the intention to kill them that night. It was actually Paddy they were looking for. So we were
the son.
The son. And it was just the mother and father there. She had sort of had a run for the gun. She tried to grab the gun, and
he still killed her.
Well, she still died. Like, it wasn't the intention to go that night and kill her. It was just circumstances, the way it turned out. And then her husband came running into the room at that time, and you know, it was just the gun was turned on him then. It was all over in a split second.
But is that plausible?
You've said that the target was Paddy Fox.
Yes.
But Paddy Fox was in prison at the time.
Aye.
Or was it the case that any member of the family would do?
Well, looking back now, I think any member of the family would have done.
Either way, the killings left the families paralysed with fear.
You thought they might come back for more?
As soon as come dark, and it's an awful thing to say, I lived out in the country and I lived in a bungalow, and for me to go to the toilet, I used to get down on my hands and knees to go to the toilet rather than walk past the window in case they see me shot at. That's the fear that I had.
Some Republicans believe that fear was part of a plan and that loyalists were colluding with the state. A deliberate strategy intended to weaken Republicans and make them more willing to compromise.
I would argue that at some level there was a degree of collusion with the state, knowing that the Republican movement was at a senior level, unknown to the rest of us, but at senior level the Republican movement was contemplating a ceasefire.
Lawrence Maguire claims Billy Wright was being fed information about his targets.
All intelligence come from Wright.
And where did he tell you he was getting his intelligence from?
From police officers that were working with him.
Maguire says Wright was getting information on who to target and how to find them.
If somebody changed their car or something, he would have had the new car reg and what sort of car it was. If they had more than one address that they were staying at, he would have had maybe several addresses for whoever he was looking for.
So basically from day to day, Billy Wright was telling you that he was getting up-to-date information from the police.
Yes, that's what he was saying to us. He was getting it all from his sources within the police.
Were you ever there when he met his sources in the police?
I was in the car a couple of times, but he got out and going up alleyways and stuff to meet them.
Could this be true? Is it possible that Billy Wright was getting information from the security forces? There is clear evidence police and soldiers were passing intelligence to the largest loyalist group, the UDA. The man controlling much of that information, Brian Nelson, was a secret army agent. But was this what was happening in mid-Ulster in the 1990s? Was Billy Wright, like Brian Nelson, working for Britain as a state agent?
Readily available for us in the 90s. With the intelligence we needed to attack the people that needed to be attacked.
In this previously unbroadcast recording of Billy Wright, he claimed he was targeting those the state could not.
Indeed, members of security forces have said this, that we done what the army and the police couldn't do. We put the Easter Room Brigade IRA on the run.
Billy Wright and British military intelligence shared a common enemy in the East Tyrone IRA.
In the 1980s, British intelligence identified the East Tyrone IRA as a particular threat, concluding that they could not be fought by police or by conventional forces. From then on, more IRA members were killed in County Tyrone than any other area, most ambushed by the SAS.
It seems undercover troops were lying in wait for the IRA attackers. The soldiers formed a semicircle around the police station and simply waited.
Included among the dead was Tommy McKerney's brother, Podrick, one of 8 IRA members killed in an ambush at Loughgall police station. But while those in the IRA accepted they could be killed, they didn't expect members of their families to be murdered. We know Billy Wright claimed to his own men that he was getting the information to attack Republican families from the police. Was he also being protected?
We've been told by 2 senior security sources that Billy Wright was an agent. Both sources say he was working for police and military. But what sort of agent was he? Was he an informer? Was he being leaked information by police officers? Or was he being directed to kill specific people? The truth is, we don't know for certain. What we can say is there was a shocking failure by the authorities to stop him and his gang's murderous campaign and to bring him to justice.
It would be wrong to think that loyalist paramilitaries were given free rein. As many as 10,000 went to prison throughout the 30 years of the Troubles, including members of Billy Wright's UVF gang. But were some allowed to get away with murder?
40-odd murders and then so few people convicted, to me tells a tale in itself.
As part of a historical reinvestigation into Troubles-related deaths, retired Detective Chief Inspector Dave Hoare examined over 60 murders in Northern Ireland.
It raises the question, did the RUC try hard enough, or were they just not good enough to deal with the Mid-Ulster UVF? Well, I don't buy the argument that they weren't good enough. They were certainly good enough.
13 years after their murders, Dave Hoare reviewed the deaths of Jack and Kevin McKerney, killed in the family butcher's shop. He found that crucial evidence from the murders had been lost. When he went to re-examine a partially destroyed parka jacket found in the burnt-out getaway car, it had disappeared.
There was no record of its disappearance. And there could only be 2 explanations for that. One, that it, through administrative chaos or incompetence, it had been discarded and disposed of, or it had been deliberately disposed of.
It's not the only piece of evidence that has gone missing in cases involving Billy Wright's UVF team. Other forensic evidence has also disappeared. And in 1998, hundreds of police files dealing with Republican, Loyalist and security force killings in mid-Ulster were destroyed because of reported asbestos contamination. Among the files destroyed were interview notes relating to the murders attributed to Billy Wright's gang.
I can't say how huge the destruction of the records was in denying the families probably the opportunity of ever mounting a successful criminal prosecution. There were health and safety measures that could have been taken to clean those exhibits quite safely and retain them. But that wasn't done, and it seems there was a cost implication to it. The decision was made to destroy all of those exhibits, which were vital evidence in unsolved murder investigations. That evidence has then gone forever when you did it.
Police said there were no admissions in the interview notes that were destroyed, and say that actual evidential loss was minimal.
The opportunities for finding out what happened are shrinking, but there is one other person who could hold the answers, a prolific killer who was present at the planning or execution of almost all of the murders we've looked at.
You said that in the Mid-Ulster team there were 3 key shooters.
Yes.
Gunmen. Mark Fulton was one.
Yes.
Now deceased. You were one.
Yes.
The third man has never been charged with any terrorist offence. How many people do you think he killed?
No, I would say somewhere between 10 and 15.
Multiple sources have told us this is the third gunman. Seen here in his current role as an outreach worker with the Evangelical Elim Church in Portadown.
My name's Alan Oliver. I'm 42 years of age and I have been born and bred in Portadown, lived there all my life.
Alan Oliver is a man who appears to have turned his life around.
I was heavily involved in organised crime and political violence. In no way do I stand today here to justify that.
He was a close associate of Billy Wright. They're pictured here together at a house party in Portadown in 1990, at a time when Oliver's name would come up regularly in police files.
Intelligence suggests that Oliver was a gunman in the murders, but he was never convicted of one, and neither was Wright.
Oliver has been linked in court to the killing of 3 people at the mobile shop in Craigavon in 1991. 2 of the victims were teenagers, 19-year-old Eileen Duffy and 16-year-old Katrina Rennie. The primary target was a former Sinn Féin member who owned the shop, but it seems anyone at the scene would be killed. The man who drove the getaway car was caught, and he named Oliver as the gunman in the triple murder, but it wasn't enough to justify charging him. And Oliver avoided charges again in another triple murder just 8 months later, this time at a forklift factory in Craigavon. Another UVF member told police he handed the murder weapon to Alan Oliver. The intended target was a Sinn Féin member who would often take lifts with two of the men. And Oliver is the chief suspect in the murders of both Bernadette McKerney's husband and her parents. He may be one of Northern Ireland's most prolific serial killers still alive today. So why has he never been charged? We wrote to Alan Oliver to ask him about the evidence pointing to his involvement in killings. He never replied, so I went to ask him in person.
Mr. Oliver, my name's Mandy McCauley. I'm from the BBC. I want to ask you about a series of murders that were carried out across mid-Ulster. You have been connected by multiple sources, by intelligence, to a series of multiple murders across mid-Ulster. Did you murder these people, Mr. Oliver? Mr. Oliver, did you murder this woman? Did you murder Teresa Fox? She tried to protect herself with a broom. Mr. Oliver, did you murder her husband, Charles Fox? These people were all murdered. Multiple sources place you at the scene, Mr. Oliver. Kevin McKerney, 2 young girls gunned down at a mobile shop in Craigavon, Mr. Oliver. Eileen Duffy, 19. Katrina Rennie, she was 16. Do you remember? You're placed at the scene. Why won't you talk to us? Are you being protected?
Billy Wright and Alan Oliver were not the only loyalists whom the authorities failed to bring the most serious charges against. Wright's predecessor was just as ruthless a killer. His name was Robin Jackson, and he was leader of the Mid-Ulster UVF from the mid-70s. He's believed to be personally involved in the murders of up to 50 people.
He was a terrorist. My understanding would be that he was a murderer, a prolific murderer, a very, very dangerous, very ruthless man. I never investigated him.
In 1973, Jackson was involved in a murder but wasn't prosecuted. These are copies of an army logbook that record Robin Jackson's first arrest. They've been kept secret for decades. He'd been identified by the victim's wife, but the charges were later dropped. A number of security sources have told us they believe this was the point Jackson, in return for avoiding prosecution, was recruited as a state agent. Robin Jackson's UVF murder gang included serving soldiers and RUC officers.
It would have been a case of meeting Republican terror with greater loyalist terror. That would have been the rationale behind it.
This former policeman was Jackson's accomplice in the murder of a Catholic shopkeeper.
Pretty sectarian, pretty extreme stuff, but the murder of innocent working class Protestants was pretty sectarian, pretty horrific.
Operating in the 70s, the gang spread terror across mid-Ulster, killing up to 120 people, mostly Catholics. Both Billy Wright and Robin Jackson spent time in jail for lesser offences, but got away with murder.
Yes, that's when the last voted.
Jared Shackley taking that.
Yes, and
he's the one that's not in the photograph, so he's taking it.
Robin Jackson had been thought to have retired and handed over leadership of the Mid-Ulster UVF to Wright. But Eamon Kearns has always believed that both men were involved in the murder of his sons because of reports that they had been seen near the family home. When no one was charged, he sent a complaint to the police ombudsman.
I remember Mr. and Mrs. Cairns coming into the office very well. They were with their daughter Roisin, and Roisin, I remember, was 11 on the day that her brothers were murdered. He said that he believed that Billy Wright and Robin Jackson were involved in his son's murder, and that he believed that they'd been protected from prosecution because they were state agents.
There were 11 suspects in the case, and police arrested 9 men, including Jackson and Wright. But Nuala O'Loan's investigators were unable to find any evidence linking the 2 men to the murders.
We looked at all the papers which were available from the police. The exhibits were all missing at this stage, which was a matter of concern. All that had gone, wasn't to be found at all, with no explanation. We know who was arrested for this murder, but how or why they were arrested, there's no evidence. There's no paper trail. It was a very strange way to record an investigation, if you like, if you were going to go to prosecution. There was so much missing.
But without evidence linking Wright and Jackson to the murders, Nuala O'Loan couldn't order a reopening of the investigation to test Eamon Kearns' belief they were behind the murders. But we have found supporting evidence. Because Robin Jackson and Billy Wright had conspired to murder Gerard and Rory Kearns a year earlier, and Lawrence Maguire had been assigned to pull the trigger.
Robin was the main one, and that's the first time I'd met the fella. He was the man that was running it that night.
So Robin Jackson was the one who planned to kill the Kearns brothers? And that was the first time you met him when they attacked. Where did you plan the attack?
It was a flat somewhere. I can't be 100% certain where the flat was.
The leaders of the Mid-Ulster UVF planned to murder all 3 of the Kearns brothers.
And can you remember anything of what he said?
No, he just not heard that much about him. And it was probably a bit in awe of the guy, But no, it's him and Wright done most of the talking, but
so
Robin,
Billy Wright was there that night?
Oh, aye, he was there. He was always there.
So your instructions were that if you went to the Kearns house in Bleary, you were to kill any male that you saw in the house?
Yeah.
So if the 3rd brother, if he had been there, you'd have killed?
He would have been killed as well.
And if the father had been there?
He would have been done too. So he would. The instructions was to kill the 3 brothers, and if there was anybody else, like if they had mates in, they would have probably have got it too. They wouldn't have been taking time to ask for names,
That night, in October 1992, Lawrence Maguire sat off in the car with 3 other men.
We were on our way out to do the Kearnses, and we got a call over the radio to say to abort. There was a helicopter in the sky just above them. So we just turned the car around and we made our way out towards Banbridge direction. And we had to get changed, get our clothes off in the car and try and get our own clothes back on. We had boiler suits on that night.
Lawrence Maguire was in jail by the time the Kearns brothers were actually killed. But the murders followed the plan set out by Robin Jackson and Billy Wright in the meeting the year before. It means Lawrence Maguire's account of a conspiracy to kill Gerard and Rory Kearns is important new evidence. We showed his testimony to the former Ombudsman, Nuala O'Loan.
I know Robin Jackson was involved in that one.
In the murder of Gerard and Rory Kearns?
Yes. Wright done most of the talking, but
so Billy Wright was there that night?
Oh, aye, he was there. He was always there.
It's just very shocking. You know, the fact that a year before they had decided they were going to kill these boys. And they kept that up for a year, and then they did go and kill them. So, if that evidence had been available, it would have changed a lot of things.
Would you reopen the investigation based on this evidence?
Yes, I would. I would want to go back and see what else was to be found and what else could lead you into possible identification of the gunmen who killed Rory and Jared Kearns.
In the absence of any new investigation, the official finding is that there is no evidence of agents or collusion involved in the Kearns murders. Police told us there should be no hiding place for any officer who broke the law, and any evidence of wrongdoing should be independently investigated. None of that is any comfort to Sheila Kearns.
There'll never be, while I'm on earth, no. I'll never get peace. Never. I know I'm glad that the other children are getting on and, you know, are getting on with their lives, but...
Is there anything that would bring you closure? Is there anything?
No, there's never, ever, nothing ever bring me closure, because I never bring Jared and Rory back.
Maguire's testimony proves the Kearns brothers' murders were not random. They had been targeted for over a year. And they appear to have been singled out because of their family connections.
You'd spoken about the Kearns' cousin, Sheena Campbell. She was killed the year before, in fact, the month that the aborted attempt happened. Did you know anything about that one?
That would have been Robin's team that would have done that.
Robin Jackson?
Yes, his team would have done that.
Why are you sure?
Because I'd heard it mentioned a few times.
Do you think there was a connection between, you know, Sheena Campbell was the Kearns' cousin? Do you think that was a coincidence?
I would say it was more to do with, like, her being related to them. It seems like it was, that family was bound to suffer.
Was there a deliberate strategy to kill family members of committed Republicans? Billy Wright certainly thought so.
I don't come to the IRA. But never again would there be a Taban. Never again would there be an Enniskillen. Whenever the reality of 8 or 9 people down came home to its own community, it wasn't long until internal pressures within the Republican movement and nationalist community changed its direction.
The effect of his murderous campaign in the 1990s was fear, loathing, and most of all, exhaustion.
Two things were happening. The British Army was killing active Republicans. Loyalism was killing relatives of Republicans. I think perhaps the effect was that it left the organisation and its support base feeling vulnerable rather than anything else, and it created a sense of vulnerability, which facilitated in turn an acceptance of the ceasefire.
There were many more dark days to come for the people of Northern Ireland before that ceasefire would come to pass. But it was the families of the victims like those in the Rising Sun pub in Greysteel who gave strength to negotiator John Hume, urging him to continue talks with the Republican leadership to bring an end to 30 years of conflict.
One of the most moving times for me in that whole period was after the Greysteel killings and murders. I was at one of the funerals, and a young daughter of one of the victims came over to me at the funeral and said, "Mr. Hume, we prayed for you round my daddy's coffin last night, that you would be successful so that what has happened to us wouldn't happen to any other family. And I was so moved that I broke down and wept on the spot.
A ceasefire did come, leading to the end of the conflict and allowing jailed killers like Lawrence Maguire an early release from prison. But for the victims of that final burst of violence, it was too late.
And the final part of this series is next Tuesday here on BBC One Northern Ireland, starting at the earlier time of 8:30.